Why do we use the terms ex-husband and ex-wife, or even the terms former husband and former wife as born-again believers, when God declared that a husband and wife are no longer two, but one flesh? I know it might not stand out that much at the moment of why I would ask this question with the current way of thinking in many cultures, but hear me out. For example, if you truly considered what Jesus said in Matthew, the 19th chapter and the 6th verse, which says, "Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh." I'm reading the King James Version. "What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." And what he said in Mark, the 10th chapter and the 8th verse, "And they twain shall be one flesh." So then they are no more twain, but one flesh. Twain means two. So they're no more two. They're one flesh. As well as what Paul said in Ephesians, the 5th chapter and the 31st verse. "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh." Most would have to agree that the scriptures are all saying the same thing. That once two believers in God get married, he joins them together. They are no longer just two individuals anymore, but one, correct? Meaning, when God wrote down his record of, let's say, Joseph and Mary getting married, that wouldn't change in his books, not unless an unrighteous condition that he gave occurred in that marriage. I will admit, I've used the terms ex-husband and ex-wife many times in the past to label someone after their divorce, because that was how I grew up thinking. However, as I continue to study to show myself approved before God, I'm learning that those labels have no place with, and keep this in mind because this is the key. The labels have no place with born-again believers under the new covenant. Only believers are in covenant with God. Those in the world are living by the world's standards, but as believers, we are required to live by God's standards. For example, let's see what Paul said to husband and wives in 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, the 10th through the 15th verse. "And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord, if any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace." Keep that last scripture in mind. I'm going to go over it shortly. According to these scriptures, Paul said the unbelieving is not held to these standards of living. If they depart, let them depart. However, if you go back and read 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter and the 10th verse, you will realize Paul is making a statement to believers by saying the Lord commanded this. And then he goes on to give the wife two options, correct? So why do you think the believing wife is only given two options in this command from the Lord? Remember, it's from God, not Paul. Well, if you take a look at a few scriptures that Jesus gave as he taught God's new doctrine, you will see that they consist of many new commandments for the new covenant, which includes the one flesh principle that Jesus enforced for marriage, which makes it a sin if the wife divorces and marries another man. That's why it says she must remain unmarried or be reconciled. And if you pay close attention to the last sentence in 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter and 11th verse, the husband still isn't allowed to divorce her. But is that the case of what he said in the 15th verse? He said, if they depart, let them depart. But he was talking about the unbelievers. Please understand, this applies solely to any believer under the new covenant, from the time Jesus was teaching these new commands even up until our present day. In other words, based on those changes to marriage under the new covenant, the husband and wife are bound as one. And because of that, God only gave the wife those two options going forward. Hopefully it's all starting to make sense by now. Remember, Paul declared that this command came from the Lord. This truth goes hand in hand with everything Jesus taught regarding divorce and marriage as he ministered. If you look up Matthew, the 5th chapter, the 31st through the 32nd verse, you will see the first time he actually started these teachings, which reads, in the 31st verse it says, "It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement." Have you ever asked yourself, where did Jesus get that saying from? Well, let's take a look at Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter, the 1st through the 2nd verse, which reads, starting at the 1st verse, "When a man have taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he have found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house." As you can see, Jesus is quoting this very commandment found in the Old Covenant, which was the Old Testament. So let's continue. Deuteronomy 24:2 says, "And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife." So based on this commandment found in the Old Testament, God gave Moses these instructions, which allowed both the husband and the wife permission to remarry after their divorce without committing a sin based on Deuteronomy 24:2. Now let's read what Jesus goes on to say in Matthew, the 5th chapter, and the 32nd verse. "But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife," divorce basically, "saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery." In other words, Jesus changed a few guidelines with the subject of divorce at this very moment in Scripture. For example, based on what God permitted in the Old Covenant, a man was not limited to the one exception of fornication to divorce his wife. This is due to the fact that Deuteronomy 24:1 only stated, because he had found some uncleanness in her, he could divorce his wife. It was that simple. And on top of that, both husbands and wives were allowed to remarry without committing any sin, as stated before. However, that's not what Jesus is declaring anymore in Matthew, the 5th chapter, and the 32nd verse. Remember, Jesus said in Matthew, the 5th chapter, and the 31st verse, "It hath been said," which simply refers to what was written in Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter, the 1st through the 2nd. But like I said, as you read Matthew, the 5th chapter, and 32nd verse, he's making the change to Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter, and the 1st through the 2nd. If either spouse divorces and remarry outside the one exception of fornication given in the New Covenant guidelines, then that husband and wife will both commit the sin of adultery, because in God's eyes, they are still joined as one flesh, regardless of their divorce, according to the one flesh principle that Jesus enforced, which is found in several scriptures of the New Testament. Meaning, even after they get legally divorced in any court on this earth, their one flesh union declared by God still has them bound as husband and wife. Let not man put asunder. However, as I mentioned, you have the one exception of a spouse committing fornication, which gives any husband or any wife permission to divorce their spouse if they choose to, which is the only rule given to break that one flesh union according to Scripture. In that case, I believe the terms of ex-husband and ex-wife can apply accordingly, because that divorce or broken union is the only exception allowed by God on earth. Remember, every other label of a divorced believer, according to God, in each scripture bounds the husband remaining a husband and the wife remaining a wife. One flesh. According to Jesus Christ, if that husband and wife are both born again believers in covenant with God, they are one flesh, even after their quote-unquote divorce. That doesn't change. I go over these complex scenarios in a previous video I made, which expounds on this truth a little bit more regarding how Jesus changed the rules for divorce under the new covenant. If you get a chance, please check it out to get a better understanding. I'll put a link down below, but like I said, as Jesus Christ taught God's new doctrine, the new covenant, he declared this truth in Matthew, the 5th chapter, and the 32nd verse, as we read, in Matthew, the 19th chapter, and the 9th verse, in Mark, the 10th chapter, the 11th through the 12th verse, in Luke, the 16th chapter, and the 18th verse, and Paul confirmed this in Romans, the 7th chapter, the 2nd through the 3rd verse, as well as 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, and the 39th verse. Every scripture says the same thing. Ultimately, believers, born-again believers, can't be labeled as ex-husband or ex-wife in God's earthly kingdom unless it falls within the guidelines of fornication inside of marriage, the one exception that Jesus gave. They are no more two but one flesh. Please let that truly sink in. They are not ex-husband or ex-wife. They are one flesh with their first spouse accordingly. I pray that as we continue to seek God for his righteousness and his truth, our minds will be renewed together.